Let me be direct with you from the outset because what happened in Syrian airspace on April 15th demands clarity. What occurred was not a routine Israeli airstrike being met with standard air defenses. It was not a tactical adjustment or a minor setback. What occurred was 15 Israeli F-16 fighter jets, some of the most advanced aircraft in the Middle East, approaching their target coordinates in eastern Syria and being forced to abort their mission because Iranian air defense systems achieved radar lock and the Israeli pilots made the assessment that proceeding would result in aircraft losses they could not justify. I am looking at flight tracking data that has been analyzed by multiple independent defense observers, cross-referenced with Iranian state media reports and Syrian military sources. What this data shows is not a propaganda claim. It is not an exaggeration for domestic consumption. What it shows is an Iranian-made air defense system designated Bavar 373, which Iran describes as equivalent to the Russian S-400, forcing Israeli aircraft to turn back before reaching their strike coordinates for the first time in over a decade of Israeli operations in Syrian airspace. In the next 22 minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly what the Bavar 373 system is and why Western analysts initially dismissed it as inferior to Russian systems, why 15 F-16s turning back represents a strategic shift in the regional air superiority balance, and why this single aborted mission has implications for American military planning regarding Iran that go far beyond one failed airstrike. This is the Daily Brief. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are covering is based on technical analysis from radar tracking systems and signal intelligence that confirm this was not routine air defense activity. Let's start with the Bavar 373 air defense system itself, because understanding what Iran deployed tells you everything about how seriously this changes Israeli operational freedom in Syrian airspace. The Bavar 373, which translates to Belief 373 in English, is Iran's domestically produced long-range air defense system. Iran has claimed since its unveiling in 2019 that the system is comparable to or superior to Russia's S-300 system and approaches S-400 capability. Western defense analysts initially treated these claims with skepticism. The assumption was that Iran lacked the technological sophistication, the manufacturing precision, and the radar technology required to produce a system truly comparable to Russian equipment that took decades to develop and refine. The consensus assessment was that Bavar 373 might be functional, but would be significantly inferior in range, tracking capability, and resistance to electronic countermeasures. What happened on April 15th suggests that consensus assessment was wrong, or at minimum that Iranian air defense capabilities have improved substantially beyond what Western intelligence services believe possible. According to flight data analyzed by The Aviationist and confirmed by Israeli defense sources speaking to Channel 12 News, a formation of Israeli F-16I Sufa fighters approached Syrian airspace from the southwest, likely targeting Iranian weapons storage facilities or Hezbollah logistics positions in the Deir ez-Zor region. This is a flight path Israeli aircraft have used repeatedly over the past 5 years with minimal air defense interference. At approximately 02:47 a.m. local time, Syrian air defense radars activated. Within 90 seconds, multiple surface-to-air missile systems achieved tracking locks on the approaching Israeli aircraft. The Israeli formation broke off the approach, executed evasive maneuvers, deployed countermeasures, and returned to Israeli airspace without engaging their targets. The Israeli Air Force has not officially commented on the mission or its cancellation. Syrian and Iranian media reported the incident as a successful air defense interception. And critically, no Israeli government spokesperson has denied that the mission was aborted or claimed that Israeli aircraft successfully struck their intended targets. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing that Israeli air superiority over Syria, which has been assumed as a constant for over a decade, may no longer be guaranteed. Announcement number 1, the Bavar 373 deployment was not an isolated system. And this one matters more than the aborted mission itself, because it reveals a comprehensive Iranian strategy to create an integrated air defense network across Syria that Israeli cannot suppress without accepting aircraft losses. According to analysis by the Institute for the Study of War and Regional Defense Observers, Iran has deployed at least 4 Bavar 373 batteries to Syrian territory over the past 8 months. The systems are positioned at locations in Damascus, Aleppo, Deir ez-Zor, and Palmyra, creating overlapping coverage zones that make it extremely difficult for Israeli aircraft to approach strategic targets without entering engagement envelopes of multiple air defense systems simultaneously. This is not random placement. This is integrated air defense network design exactly as Soviet doctrine prescribed and exactly as Russia employed in Syria to protect its own forces and Assad regime positions. Each Bavar 373 battery has an engagement range that Iranian sources claim extends to 300 kilometers for high-altitude targets and 200 kilometers for low-altitude targets. Those ranges, if accurate, create coverage bubbles that overlap across most of strategically significant Syrian territory. Colonel Zvika Haimovich, former commander of Israel's Aerial Defense Division, stated in an interview with the Times of Israel that integrated air defense networks are the most significant challenge modern air forces face, because you cannot suppress one system without exposing yourself to others, and the cost of achieving local air superiority becomes prohibitively high unless you are willing to commit overwhelming resources. Israel could destroy these air defense systems. Israel possesses the weapons, the aircraft, and the operational planning to conduct a large-scale suppression of enemy air defenses campaign. But that operation would require dozens of aircraft, would take hours to execute, would alert every Iranian and Syrian position in the theater, and would almost certainly result in aircraft losses that Israeli public opinion and military leadership are not prepared to accept for the objective of maintaining freedom of action over Syrian territory. And here is the truly significant element. Once Israel loses the credible ability to strike Iranian positions in Syria at will, Iran gains freedom of action to move weapons, position forces, and construct infrastructure without constant fear of immediate Israeli airstrikes. That fundamentally alters the balance of power across the entire Levant. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, the F-16s turned back because Israeli assessment of Bavar 373 capability changed based on recent intelligence. This is the part that reveals how significant Israeli intelligence failure has been regarding Iranian technological advancement. According to reporting by Walla News and confirmed by defense sources, Israeli signals intelligence detected unusual radar signatures from Syrian air defense systems in March 2026. The signatures did not match known characteristics of Syrian-operated Russian systems. They did not match older Iranian air defense radars that Israeli electronic warfare systems were designed to counter. Israeli conducted test flights, deliberately approaching Syrian airspace to provoke radar activation and collect electronic intelligence. The data collected showed that Bavar 373 systems were operating with tracking precision and resistance to jamming that significantly exceeded Israeli previous assessments of Iranian capability. Stay with me because this is where the technical details reveal the strategic miscalculation. Israeli electronic warfare systems, the pods and internal equipment that Israeli F-16s and F-15s carry to jam and spoof enemy radars, were designed based on intelligence about Iranian radar technology from 2015 to 2020. If Iranian radar technology made significant advances in the past 3 years, which the April 15th incident suggests it has, then Israeli countermeasures are optimized against systems that no longer represent Iranian actual capability. That means Israeli pilots flying into Syrian airspace are operating with electronic warfare protection that may not work as advertised against current Iranian systems. And if Israeli command knows that, then ordering pilots to proceed with strikes becomes an order to accept unacceptable risks. No air force in the world sends pilots into contested airspace when you believe your defensive systems are inadequate. You either upgrade your countermeasures, which takes months or years, or you stop flying those missions until you solve the problem. Israeli has chosen option 2, at least temporarily, which is why those 15 F-16s turned back. Announcement number 3, and this is what almost no one in Western media is explaining correctly. The strategic implication is not that Israel cannot strike Syria anymore. The implication is that Israel must now choose between accepting aircraft losses or allowing Iran freedom of action in Syria, and there is no third option that avoids both costs. For the past decade, Israel has conducted hundreds of airstrikes in Syria. The operational model was low-risk strikes from standoff ranges or quick penetration raids with minimal air defense threat. Pilots came home, targets were destroyed. Israeli maintained escalation dominance. The cost-benefit calculation heavily favored continued operations. That calculation just changed. If striking Iranian positions in Syria now requires accepting that 1 or 2 F-16s might be shot down on any given mission, Israeli leadership must weigh the value of destroying a weapons convoy or a logistics facility against the political cost of losing pilots, the operational cost of losing aircraft, and the strategic cost of Iranian propaganda victory from parading captured Israeli airmen on television. For high-value targets, Israeli will accept that risk. If intelligence indicates an imminent transfer of advanced weapons to Hezbollah, or if Iranian commanders are gathering at a known location, Israeli will commit the resources to penetrate Syrian air defenses regardless of risk. But for routine interdiction strikes, for degrading Iranian logistics, for maintaining constant pressure on Iranian presence, the cost-benefit calculation no longer justifies the risk. That means Iran gains breathing room. Iranian weapons convoys that previously would have been struck within hours of detection might now cross Syria unmolested because Israeli decides the target does not justify the risk. Iranian infrastructure that would have been destroyed in its early construction phases might now be completed because Israeli cannot afford to conduct continuous surveillance and strike operations. And the cumulative effect of dozens or hundreds of strikes that do not happen is that Iranian presence in Syria becomes more entrenched, more capable, and more threatening to Israeli security than it was when Israel could strike at will. Think about what this represents strategically. When air superiority, which has been the foundation of Israeli military doctrine since 1967, becomes contested rather than guaranteed, every element of Israeli operational planning must be reevaluated. You cannot conduct the same ground operations if you cannot guarantee air support. You cannot position forces the same way if air supply routes might be contested. You cannot make the same assumptions about escalation dominance if the other side can impose costs on your most advanced capabilities. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the official statements, because Israeli government talking points about maintaining security and operational freedom do not match what Israeli pilots are being told in classified mission briefings. The public narrative is that Israel retains the capability to strike any target in Syria whenever Israeli leadership deems it necessary. Defense officials have stated that one aborted mission does not represent a strategic shift. The message to the Israeli public is remain confident in the IDF's ability to protect national security. The classified briefings being delivered to Israeli F-16 squadrons tell a different story. Pilots are being informed that penetrating Syrian airspace now requires full suppression of enemy air defenses packages, which means multiple aircraft, extensive electronic warfare support, and acceptance that some missions may be canceled if the risk assessment changes. Pilots are being told that the era of low-risk strikes is over, and that future operations will look more like the high-intensity missions Israeli conducted against Syrian nuclear facilities in 2007 than the routine strikes of the past 5 years. That is a fundamental operational shift, and it has consequences that ripple across every aspect of Israeli military planning. If aircraft must be concentrated for major strike packages rather than distributed across multiple smaller missions, that reduces the total number of strikes Israeli can conduct in any given time period. If electronic warfare assets must support every mission, that creates resource bottlenecks that limit operational tempo. If planning cycles extend because each mission requires more detailed intelligence and coordination, that gives adversaries more time to move targets and adjust defenses. Think carefully about what this means for Israeli citizens living in the north. For years, you have been told that Israeli Air Force prevents Iranian weapons from reaching Hezbollah by striking convoys in Syria. You have been told that Israeli maintains awareness and the capability to act. Now, you must consider the possibility that some of those convoys are getting through because the cost of striking them has become too high. If you live in Haifa or Tiberias or any northern city within range of Hezbollah rockets, what is happening in Syrian airspace is not abstract geopolitical maneuvering. It is a question of whether the missiles that might target your city in the next war were interdicted in Syria, or whether they were allowed to reach Hezbollah because Israeli decided that destroying them was not worth losing an F-16. This pattern is not new. Throughout history, technological parity, or even technological inferiority, has allowed smaller powers to impose strategic costs on larger powers through smart deployment of defensive systems. Consider the Vietnam War and specifically the impact of Soviet surface-to-air missiles on American air operations. The United States possessed overwhelming air superiority in terms of aircraft quality, pilot training, and technological sophistication. North Vietnam had none of those advantages. What North Vietnam had was Soviet SA-2 and SA-3 surface-to-air missile systems integrated into a network that forced American aircraft to operate at altitudes and flight profiles that reduced their effectiveness. American aircraft could destroy SAM sites, and they did, repeatedly. But destroying one site required multiple aircraft, extensive planning, and acceptance of risks that sometimes resulted in aircraft losses. The cumulative effect was that American air operations became more constrained, more expensive, and less effective than American doctrine assumed they would be. Israel is not America, and Iran is not the Soviet Union supplying North Vietnam, but the principle of defensive systems imposing costs that reduce offensive freedom of action is exactly parallel. Israel can destroy Bavar 373 batteries, but doing so ties down resources, alerts the entire theater, and still leaves other systems operational that must also be suppressed. The cost of maintaining total air superiority exceeds what Israeli can sustain indefinitely, which means Iranian gains the ability to create zones where Israeli aircraft cannot operate freely. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 paths forward and understand that Israel's choice will determine whether we see major military escalation or a frozen standoff that gradually shifts in Iran's favor. Path 1: major air campaign to destroy all Iranian air defenses in Syria. Israel commits 100-plus aircraft to a sustained operation designed to eliminate every Bavar 373 battery, every associated radar, and every Iranian command and control node in Syrian territory. This reestablishes Israeli air superiority, but requires accepting aircraft losses, triggers Iranian retaliation, possibly including missile strikes on Israeli territory, and almost certainly draws Russian objections since it would create chaos in Syrian airspace, where Russian forces also operate. Probability given current political and operational constraints, 20%. Path 2, technological adaptation. Israeli invests in new electronic warfare systems, acquires or develops weapons with longer standoff ranges that allow strikes from outside Bavar 373 engagement zones, and adjusts tactics to work around Iranian air defenses rather than confronting them directly. This maintains some Israeli strike capability but accepts reduced operational freedom and allows Iranian positions in Syria to become more entrenched over time. This is the path Israeli appears to be choosing based on recent defense procurement and operational patterns. Probability 65%. Path 3, diplomatic resolution through Russian mediation. Israeli and Iran reach an understanding, brokered by Russia, which has interest in preventing uncontrolled escalation in Syria, where Iran limits its air defense deployments and weapons transfers in exchange for Israeli reducing strike frequency. Both sides maintain presence but establish deconfliction mechanisms. This is the rational outcome that minimizes escalation risks, but it requires both sides to trust Russian mediation and to accept limitations neither wants. Probability 15%. I think we are on path 2, which means Israeli is adapting to a new reality where Iranian air defenses in Syria are a permanent constraint on Israeli operations, not a temporary obstacle. That is a strategic loss for Israeli, even if no aircraft were shot down, because it represents the end of uncontested air superiority that has been central to Israeli military advantage for decades. Here is what I am watching: Israeli defense procurement over the next 6 months. If you see large contracts for advanced electronic warfare pods, for new long-range precision weapons, or for unmanned combat aerial vehicles designed to operate in contested environments, that tells you Israeli is choosing adaptation over confrontation. If you see Israeli conducting more aggressive air operations despite the risks, that suggests political pressure is forcing military action even when operational commanders counsel restraint. Also watch Iranian weapons transfers to Hezbollah. If intelligence reports show significant increases in advanced missile systems crossing from Syria into Lebanon, that tells you the new air defense reality is having the exact effect Iran intended, which is creating freedom of action for Iranian operations that were previously impossible under constant Israeli air threat. Here are the questions I want you to take away. Can Israel maintain its security model if air superiority over neighboring territories is no longer guaranteed? Can Iran resist the temptation to exploit its new defensive capabilities by escalating weapons transfers that will eventually force Israeli response regardless of costs? And can regional powers find a stable equilibrium, or are we watching the early stages of an escalation cycle that leads to wider conflict? Tell me in the comments whether you think Israel launches a major air campaign to eliminate Iranian air defenses, or whether Israeli accepts this new constraint and adapts its strategy accordingly. Tell me if you believe Iranian air defense technology is genuinely approaching Russian S-400 capability, or if this was a one-time success that will not be repeated as Israeli learns to counter it. We will keep tracking every development as this situation evolves and as both sides calculate their next moves in a game where the rules just change dramatically. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone trying to understand why air defense systems in Syria matter for regional stability and for American military planning regarding potential conflict with Iran. Turn on notifications because the next Israeli strike attempt, whether it succeeds or fails, will tell us everything about whether this was a temporary setback or a permanent strategic shift. We will be here to explain exactly what it means when it happens. We will see you in the next analysis.